Divya Siddarth graduated from Stanford in 2018 and is working to understand, preserve, and extend democracy through technological progress and innovation. Her work includes analyzing the effect of technological innovation on the future of work, evaluating privacy-preserving technology and tech policy, conceptualizing and implementing structures of data stewardship and data collaboratives, and building pathways to civic change through digital and narrative media. I'm so happy to introduce now Mrs. Siddarth to you. Thank you for being here and thank you for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fantastic so far, and it's an honor to be here. And an honor to follow the talks that we've heard already. I will right away get into my piece, which is around data coalitions for a democratic web. I know we don't have much time, so I'll try to be somewhat quick about it. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Absolutely, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so the idea I'm here to talk about, which I think builds on a lot of what we've already heard, is this concept of data coalitions and how that can democratize our digital sphere. And basically, the existing data economy we have, and I'm in the US, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I think this is true across the world, undermines the foundations of what we would want from democratic and open societies. The things that we might be looking for that we've already talked about: meaningful democratic participation, productive collaboration between individuals and organizations, broad and equitable distribution of benefits, and fair competition. These are all things that we expect and want from democratic societies. And the way that our data economy is structured really gets in the way of all of these things. So what do we do about that? And I think conventional thinking offers this choice between state-driven top-down regulation of data use, or these models that allow loosely regulated, unaccountable private organizations to operate what are essentially core public utilities for profit. And that gives us a choice, as we've discussed, between the surveillance state and surveillance capitalism. And I think a lot of the proposals and discussions here today are about how to break through that dichotomy, which doesn't need to exist, and build something meaningfully different. And here I think it's in terms of privacy and transparency over data, yes, and all of those kinds of things, but it's also in terms of the benefits that can come from having control over data. That also obviously ends up super concentrated in these entities, and communities end up having little to no access to that data to use it in the ways that they would want to and that would benefit them. And because of this, I think neither of these two approaches can really meaningfully succeed. Regulating data use in detail, as GDPR shows, and that's great progress, but it will often be several years behind the latest version of the concerns it seeks to address, and constantly needs updating. On the flip side, the network effects mean that existing attempts to limit private abuses just through competition remain basically Sisyphean. Privately operated information networks are tending towards monopoly, and regulators end up playing catch up, and people get left out of the loop every time. And the important thing here is to note that there is another option: new data governance structures that center a class of intermediary institutions that are flexible, federated, and democratically accountable. And yes, this is going to require both sides of this, right? It's going to require state regulation, it's going to require interoperability and portability and privacy regulation, all of those things. It's also going to require these unregulated private entities to have to interface with these intermediary organizations, but it won't be just one or the other. And it'll be much more about constructing these polycentric systems that could allow businesses, governments, communities, and civil society to really create new digital infrastructure that promotes fundamental rights. This is built, getting a little bit more specific, like, yes, all of that sounds great, but what does it mean? This is built on a couple of quite specific insights. The first is that data is fundamentally collective. And this is pretty intuitive. I mean, you can think about like sending an email, for example. I send you an email. Who owns which part of that data, right? Do I own the subject line, and who owns the metadata on when that email was sent and when you responded? It's very difficult in our digital and network society to really piece out individual ownership of data. And yet a lot of our data regulation is currently predicated on this idea of individual privacy and individual ownership, when it makes a lot of sense that collective structures are much more appropriate when we think about negotiating rights with data. And this kind of leads us to this idea of disclosure externalities, which is whenever you share data or give someone permission to access your data, others' data gets swept up too. And there are, really obvious examples of this, like say I did a 23andMe, which is that, the genetic data test, then, I might give them access to my genetic data, but of course they now have access to much of my parents' genetic data and my cousins and my other family members. But this is also the case in much more distributed networks. Like we can see here, there are so many connected nodes that, for example, we already know that a company like Facebook, even if I'm not signed up for Facebook, if enough of my friends are, and they've given them access to their contact list, they can basically construct a profile of me without me ever having consented to any of that, right? And so this idea of collective data and disclosure externalities gets us to a point where we say we need collective structures to really have accountable data intermediaries. These can't be individual ownership. And essentially, the insight is data cannot be owned, but it has to be governed. And that means it has to be governed the way other things are governed, the subject of shared democratic decisions, rather than these individual and unilateral ones. And this brings us to the solution that we're proposing, and this is in partnership with the Radical Exchange Foundation. This data coalition vision involves accountable, responsible intermediary institutions that basically act as fiduciaries for pooled data that are at the heart of this vision. And these could both unlock massive public benefits, facilitating accountable data sharing for things like contact tracing or tracking carbon emissions, while also protecting individual and community choice. They could allow for sharing research data between institutions, unlocking new technologies, or even just aggregation of things like individual financial or health data that could make things like credit unions and healthcare data trusts much more accessible. So we kind of see the interactions between these, as polycentric as we discussed earlier. There's going to be regulation of these data coalitions by the government. Platform entities will have to interact with data coalitions. Data coalitions themselves are legally independent and specially regulated, and they have fiduciary duties to their members, like credit unions, for example. So they have some element of collective bargaining. There also have to be ways for data coalitions to interact with each other, right? Because otherwise it's easy to have a race to the bottom in this ecosystem. And so there have to be arbitration rights between data coalitions. Organizations can be a part of data coalitions. People can be a part of data coalitions. So it's really this more ecosystem approach to how we can collectively govern our data. And, just to wrap up, it's obviously quite a heavy lift, right? Like this isn't the way we're currently doing things, and it will take some work, but there's already encouraging steps. The Digital Governance Act and the Digital Markets Act kind of move us a little bit in this direction. In India, there's a non-personal data sharing proposal. And I think one of my favorite examples is in Taiwan, where there are many data coalitions that they use to combat COVID, but also to aggregate air pollution data and water sensor data and things like this that both have that element of community choice and protect the individual privacy and allow communities to answer questions they want to answer with their data, which is something that we lose in the monopolistic structures that we currently have. And this isn't just in Taiwan. There's platform cooperatives that, like drivers cooperatives, that use this kind of data ownership structure. There's data unions online, like Streamer and Pool, that use this kind of structure. And so, I think in the end, we see that, yes, this is going to take a lot of work, but those green shoots are already there. The systems that we heard about in Estonia can feed into this. And correctly designed, these intermediaries can serve as a new layer of civil society and democratic participation, protecting these complex and collective shared interests in data, unlocking massive social benefits, and preserving the democracy that we want to underlie all of these decisions.